5 hours later.
Wow, what a day that was. If you were lucky enough to miss this whole thing, I'll briefly reiterate what happened. On August 2nd, Sonic Fox, you know, that really popular fighting game player, tweeted that they weren't enjoying the newly released hit fighting game Guilty Gear Strive as much as they'd hoped to, and what followed was a storm. There were people that felt the same way as Sonic Fox, and there were people that didn't. Then there were people calling the FGC a bunch of sheep, people shitting on Mortal Kombat, people critiquing the entire concept of an influencer, and honestly it was chaos. But much like a storm, it sort of just fizzled out and was entirely forgotten the next day. However, I'm a bit unsatisfied. When Sonic Fox said they weren't enjoying Strive as much as they'd hoped to, they said it was because they felt limited and they couldn't explain why. Not enough of us stopped at this goldmine of an opportunity to have a discussion about the design philosophy behind the game, and not enough of us tried to understand where Sonic Fox is coming from and why. Some of us have tried. There were a few instances of people trying to put into words what Sonic Fox couldn't. Of those who shared a viewpoint similar to Sonic Fox, many of them explained their issue of Strive to be that the game lacked expression, especially in comparison to previous Guilty Gear games, which they claim is much more expressive. Now, if you're not deep in the fighting game trenches and still somehow found this video, all this talk about expression in fighting games may be a bit unclear. I mean, despite seeing this word come up almost every other day now, not even once do I remember seeing somebody actually try to define it. What actually is expression in fighting games? The term itself is a bit abstract, but we have to start somewhere in this discussion, right? If we're to break this down in a way that's understandable in the context of fighting games, try viewing it as the way a player approaches or responds to scenarios in the game. Fighting games are a genre where two players, unless it's Smash, engage in several different scenarios over the course of a match, choosing how they use the different set of tools and options that the game gives to them to win as many of these scenarios as possible. Winning being whatever brings your opponent to death before you. It can be a scenario where you're trying to hit an opponent but they're blocking, so you respond by throwing them because it beats blocking. It can be a scenario where a rushdown character is trying to approach you but you want to keep a distance, so you respond by moving your character away from wherever your opponent will be. It can be a scenario where the opponent is the one pressuring you, so you respond by patiently blocking mix-ups until they leave themselves open. These are all individual scenarios that can occur within a match once it begins, but think about the way I defined expression in fighting games. It is the way a player approaches or responds to scenarios. When discussing expression, the scenario isn't what is most important. The key is the approach or response. These examples are scenarios we all run into and we don't really have control of the scenario itself, but the way we respond to the scenario with the options we have is what highlights who we are as a player. What if I replayed the previous scenarios mentioned but approached or responded to these situations differently? How about in this same scenario you prioritize going for high-low mix-ups rather than a throw? How about instead of creating distance, you just hit them on their way in, catch their approach? How about a scenario where the opponent is the one pressuring you, so you respond by throwing out a DP to beat out their pressure entirely? Same scenarios, different responses. But wait, surely that can't be all, right? Is that all that it means to talk about expression in fighting games? Having multiple options? That's it? Well, of course not. Expression goes further than this. Having multiple options is just the start. It's the groundwork for expression to sprout, a necessity for expression to even exist. Simply saying that you use X option over Y option doesn't fully explain what people mean by expression in fighting games. I don't tout about how plus R allows me to express myself a bunch simply because I had the choice of blocking on wake up or DPing on wake up and chose to DP. Rather, it goes deeper than that. Expression is not just about having multiple options, it's also about the greater purpose behind the options you choose and what that says about you as a player. Why do we choose the options that we do? When you make a choice, you make it with a reason. In fighting games, the more you understand, the deeper the reasoning can get, and the expression lies in that deepness. Take for example, a moment where I've successfully hit my opponent. This moment alone can branch into several different options. Option 1. I perform a simple combo, get some standard damage and a good setup. Option 2. I perform a difficult combo, get above average damage and a good setup. Option 3. I perform a simple combo, use some of my meter, get above average damage but a worse setup. Option 4. I perform a difficult combo, use some of my meter, get the best damage but a worse setup. You can see here that there is a ton of variety in what the outcome can be from that single moment of landing a hit. The combo that a person chooses to perform after landing that one hit will be a result of what they prioritize as a player. They may prioritize maximizing damage output, or they may prioritize strong Oki. They may prioritize saving resources, or maybe they don't mind spending resources for better rewards. They may prioritize consistency and opt for less challenging combos, or they may prefer to take the risk and choose the harder stuff. In many of these games, you can't have all of these at once, so it's up to the player to choose a combo that suits them best. Alas, I don't want the only example you receive from me to be centered around combos. That's a little cliche when discussing fighting games. How about we look at another example that involves using a system mechanic? Chain shift. To understand this one, I'm going to have to give a bit of context into how the mechanic works so that you understand why the applications are what they are. To anyone that knows chain shift and how it works, they can probably figure out how chain shift is able to tie into this video about expression in fighting games. But for those who do not know about chain shift, allow me to explain. Chain shift is a mechanic that you gain access to if you've run the last grid cycle. What is grid and the grid cycle? You know what, I don't have the time to explain grid, let's just skip that part. All you really need to know is that at the end of a cycle, the player with the most grid blocks enters Vorpal state where they deal more damage and have access to a few more system mechanics, like the one we're talking about, chain shift. The key points to chain shift are: it cancels almost any move your character is currently doing on hit, block, or even on whiff. Think Guilty Gear Roman cancels. It has 0 frames of startup and 0 frames of recovery. It is basically an in-game pause button. It can only be used by whoever was winning the grid war at the start of the current cycle, and after it is used, you will exit the advantage state that you received by winning that grid war, meaning that chain shift can no longer be used. The next time it can be used is by the player who has the most grid at the start of the next cycle. I hope that was digestible. There is more to it, like really special cancels and losing all your current grid in exchange for meter and stuff, but the key points are all I think you need to know. Chain shift may not seem like all that after only hearing the key points, but once you get deep into the game, you start to see the many different applications available for this precious limited resource, and witness the expression on display in the game with a singular system mechanic alone. When you use chain shift, nobody's getting another opportunity to use it until the next cycle. You might not even win the next cycle, so you could be left without grid for even longer. This means that your application of the tool is very important, because you won't be getting it often. You are encouraged to make a smart choice on how you use the tool. These are generalized examples that give you a glimpse into how one mechanic that cancels your current action and freezes the screen can be used in so many different ways to fit a purpose that the individual player desires. This is one of my favorite things about fighting games and demonstrates the expression to be found within the genre. I love that I can play and have all these different options so often in a match and choose all these different options that suit me best so I can win in the way that I want to. The way you approach neutral, the way you pressure your opponent, the way you defend yourself, the way you use your resources, the combos you choose to do, and more. There are just so many different elements of the game that you can approach with your own flavor. You make the character your own. This feeling of freedom of choice or carving out your own unique style isn't something that comes instantly though. Realistically, you're not going to pick up a fighting game and immediately put that much thought into decision making, much less have a distinct way of playing your character. In the early stages, what most of us are looking for is simply improvement. When first starting, following a character guide or emulating stronger players are great ways to improve quickly. The stage where you start to add your own color to your character comes later and isn't really the sort of thing that can be forced. It comes with experience, trying new things here and there in a set, seeing what you like best, and gaining a greater understanding of what your character is capable of. Pat the Flip, an FGC writer that I'm a big fan of, wrote an article that talks about this and goes a little more in depth about doing it for yourself. For those interested, I will leave a link in the description. So, to me, a fighting game has a lot of room for expression when there are different meaningful options that a player can purposefully choose from to achieve the same outcome that we're all striving for, a win. It's when players are able to take different routes to reach this goal. When you're consciously reasoning and choosing one of these different options, you are enacting your own expression. And that's why Guilty Gear Strive is disappointing, right? I mean, that's one of the common criticisms players have of the actual gameplay. Strive apparently has little room for individual expression, especially relative to previous Guilty Gear games, and that upsets a lot of players. I do believe that Guilty Gear Strive has less room for individual expression than previous Guilty Gear games, by the way, but with everything that's been said so far, this would imply that this is a bad thing. Well, it's not that simple. Oh god. You see what more room for expression gets you? Skullgirls. And I like Skullgirls, but I don't love it. I'm a fan, I like watching the game, I like playing some of the characters, I enjoy the freedom it gives me. When I realized that you can make any single move in the character's moveset, barring supers, an assist, I audibly gasped. In tag team fighting games, I'm so used to the developers essentially picking the assists for you, only letting you pick an assist from a selection of about 3 moves they already chose for you, instead of how Skullgirls lets you input any command in the character's moveset and use it as your assist. I can put something totally pointless in here, which is funny, but any move I think would be great as an assist, I can literally just have it as my assist. It's just... sometimes that freedom is a bit too much for me. This game can feel like one of the most oppressive fighting games I have ever played. It is cranked with such relentless, brutal mix-up that is thrown at me at any unexpected moment, over and over until I'm nothing but a corpse. I'm sure that this is what we all want to do to other people in any fighting game we play, but we can't. For good reason. Skullgirls has so much flexibility that I can create situations where I can perform mix-ups like this on my opponent before my original combo has even ended, with pretty much anyone in the cast. I'm sure everyone likes being the one to do this to other people, but being on the receiving end can be an awful experience. I know people do like this, or at least some are willing to put up with it if they're going to be doing the same to other people. However, others hate it. Even when you're playing against someone of a similar skill level, it can just be unfun to be put in the blender and hit over and over while feeling like you don't even get to play. People hate set play characters in other games for similar reasons, but in Skullgirls, it feels like most of the teams you go up against are able to bully you in the way that maybe only 2 or 3 characters from a different roster of a different game were able to do. The reason? The game gives so much freedom to the players that the players come up with the most f***ed up combinations they can imagine and put their opponents through hell. Now, Skullgirls is a tag fighter, and some people may believe that tag team fighting games are, by their nature, brutaler than 1v1 fighters. So to avoid that cop-out, I'll be using Dragon Ball FighterZ to make my point. Dragon Ball FighterZ is a game that I would describe as a gentler experience than Skullgirls. The system mechanics are designed to make the experience of the defender more comfortable. These system mechanics, in turn, prohibit a player's freedom to perform certain actions. The assist options are limited, preventing you from pulling something ridiculous like an anti-air command grab from a character's moveset and using it as an assist instead. You would be witnessing a totally different game. The mix-ups aren't so harsh, and they're definitely much less frequent. The game has built-in cross-up protection, preventing mix-ups like this actually needing to be blocked the other way. Sure, Dragon Ball FighterZ is a game where a character can realistically die in one touch, but at least the resource required to do this easily can only be used once per game, and at least when a character dies, the game forces both characters to reset to a round start. Whereas in Skullgirls, the player who just killed a character is free to prepare a mix-up that the opponent now has to immediately deal with when their next character jumps in. You can see how Dragon Ball FighterZ takes steps to make sure that you can't just do absolutely anything you want as the offender. When I first realized that this cross-up with Janemba wasn't real, I was disappointed. But honestly, if that cross-up protection didn't exist, this game would be a lot different and would probably be a lot less pleasant when defending. This is a good thing. Cross-up protection is a good thing. As a result, the mix-ups you're often defending against in Dragon Ball FighterZ aren't so severe. The other system mechanics, the set assists, the air tech options preventing frequent resets, the wake-up options and more, all aid in making Dragon Ball FighterZ more like the game Arxis wanted it to be, a fighting game that isn't so intimidating for beginners. Technically, they are limiting what I am capable of doing. However, fighting games are enjoyable for a whole bunch of different reasons, and if only one of those elements, expression, needs to be toned down a bit for me to not end up playing a game where I feel completely overwhelmed, then I don't mind a little less expression here and there. It's not the be-all and end-all of fighting games. The amount of expression you have is just part of the game's design. Some people may prefer fighting games that really lean into individual expression, at the cost of it potentially being a tougher fighting game. Other people may want to play games that don't feel so brutal and don't mind the game restricting players here and there to achieve that. Less room for expression isn't always a bad thing, despite how it sounds. More room for expression isn't always a good thing, despite how it sounds. It's complicated. It could be good or bad, depending on what you're looking for out of a fighting game. There's a lot of fighting games out there, and what's most important to me is that we have enough variety within the genre for me to check them all out and see what I like best. I don't want every new game in the genre to go down the route of simplification for beginners' sake, though simplification alone is not the problem. I just mean, I'd wish the companies were careful to not alienate the existing fans of their game by changing what made their existing fans like it in the first place. That's my wish at least, but it'd be naive of me not to expect these companies to gravitate to whatever it looks like is the key to getting more sales. Personally, I do prefer fighting games that give me more room for expression or whatever. I prefer Guilty Gear Plus to Guilty Gear Strive because of that. And I realize I've yet to properly focus on Strive in this video and why I think Sonic Fox and others are no longer enjoying the game so much. Okay, so Strive has been accused of having less room for individual expression, but I'll start by saying this. The system mechanics of XX and XR are designed to reward players for approaching and punish players for playing too defensively. Guilty Gear has always been aggressive. It's part of the game's identity, and it helped create the unique game flow it has. When you watched Guilty Gear, you would almost always be seeing a fast-paced, aggressive game. Yes, I know there are exceptions, but exceptions are not the rule. This element of Guilty Gear's identity is part of what its longtime fans love about the game. The rushdown, the aggression, honestly, it's pretty metal, which is fitting for Guilty Gear. So you may be thinking, if Guilty Gear has always pushed players into a rushdown playstyle, how exactly does that correlate to having room for individual expression? Doesn't that make everyone have to do the same thing? No. The system mechanics in place to encourage rushdown do matter, but they're not so prevalent that every single second of every match needs to be spent worrying about being aggressive so you get meter, or never running away so that you don't trigger negative penalty. Rather, these mechanics are strong enough to constrain you from certain playstyles like running away the entire match, but not strong enough to force everyone to obey the mechanics at all times. For example, if a chip player really wanted to, they could hit Potemkin a few times, get the life lead, and then spend the rest of the game running away. They could even do it cleverly enough to avoid triggering negative penalty, although negative penalty is certainly relevant in nerfing the runaway potential. However, running away from Potemkin the entire game is not the best idea, and the system mechanics are the reason why. The Potemkin attempting to approach Chip is building meter in the process, and allowing Potemkin to build all that meter is dangerous. When Chip eventually gets caught after all the running, and they will, the Potemkin will obliterate that ninja. Here's the thing. Chip can run away at times in that matchup. He should. However, there are multiple points in time where the Chip will need to be aggressive. It's Guilty Gear. The mechanics will not allow the character to solely run away without paying the price. And so I say it once again. Guilty Gear is rushdown focused, and almost the entire cast must adhere to that rule, in XX, Exerg, or Strive. However, it is not so strong that there is no room for variation entirely. After a lot of thinking about the intricacies to the different games' designs, I've come to the conclusion that the reason many players are dissatisfied with the room for expression in Strive is a simple one to explain. There's too much hand-holding. Hear me out. I promise I'm not one of those FGC boomers that thinks the simplification of fighting games is the death of the genre. What I believe is that, in Arxis' attempt to make Guilty Gear Strive a more accessible game gameplay-wise, the way they've chosen to go about this, while it is potentially successful, has had the consequence of the game feeling less expressive. I believe that, for the sake of making characters easier to get into, Arxis Works has designed many of the tools in Strive with a much clearer and dedicated purpose. The reason to do this is solid. It is easier to understand how to use your tools in different situations, and it's also easier to figure out how to counter your opponent's tools. They have a defined use and a defined answer. A simple example would be Anji Mito. This is Shitsu. It is a projectile that flies forwards, but on collision with anything, it will bounce and drop straight downwards. He had this in Guilty Gear X2 as well, however there is a small but significant difference. So here it is in X2. You'll often see it used after a knockdown so that Anji can get a pretty good mix-up. Occasionally, you'll also see it thrown out in neutral as a typical projectile. Here it is in Strive. You'll also see it is used after a knockdown here. Since I played Anji a bit in X2, I tried to use Shitsu and Strive in similar ways to how I did in X2. So, I tried to use it in neutral, but the move has been altered in a way that makes it hard to justify that decision anymore. As you can see, Shitsu now has a significantly longer amount of startup. It still works for use after a knockdown, but I have a hard time justifying the use of it in neutral now when it takes so long for the projectile to even appear. The move didn't even have this much startup in Anji's trailer for Strive. The trailer's version was a lot more similar to X2. This change makes me think they wanted it strictly to be an Okuzemi tool, so unfortunately I won't be occasionally using this as a projectile. To this you may say, well, the move was designed to be an Okuzemi tool, not a neutral tool. Yeah, you're right, but that's exactly my point. If a move is designed so intentionally, how much room am I given to use things in a way that is different to others? The more intentional the design, the less agency the individual player has over its use. Also, this new Gatling system, this is so limited compared to before. I know many people's initial reactions to this change in the Gatling system was confusion, believing that the older system was easier because it had a consistent flow of punch, kick, slash, heavy slash to it rather than Strive's arbitrary rules. However, in practice, I think Strive's is the simpler system both to use and to fight against. Yeah, you have to learn what Gatling routes you do have now, a whole 3 different short sequences, but since they're mostly universal and they're literally all you have, everyone is just doing the same thing. That is easier to fight against. You aren't dealing with an unexpected sequence that a player creates. Most characters have similar Gatlings in Strive and they're all pretty simple to understand. All you can really do with Gatlings is mix between will I stagger or will I throw, and maybe an extra layer here or there. You aren't getting very creative with your own pressure ideas to open up the opponent because you can't. While defending, you're waiting for the same mix-up, maybe at different times, but there isn't anything that you haven't seen before that will be thrown at you. Strive retains some legacy Guilty Gear mechanics designed to constrain full-on expression like negative penalty and risk, but it takes away the individual player's agency with how tools are used, and asks them to use it specifically for the purpose that the developers intended. This causes Strive to be a Guilty Gear game that keeps its rushdown focus, but has now homogenized the way players use their tools to enact this rushdown. For example, the Gatling system, or the specificity of special moves. This is why I think Sonic Fox finds the game limiting. This is why I find the game limiting. This is why some Guilty Gear veterans still prefer previous Guilty Gears, where the player is given more freedom or options or just choice than what Strive currently presents. I don't think Strive is doomed to be like this at its very core though. As always, there are exceptions to the rule. That is to say, there are characters in Strive that I felt had much more room for expression than could be found in the majority of the cast. We're talking 2 or 3 characters here, by the way, like Zato or Jacko. So don't be surprised that I didn't say Chip has room for expression. Having to mix between his different specials a lot does not make him feel unique to me. We're all mixing through different specials on offense, it's how you play the character. We're all doing the same thing. I'm not seeing command grab be used as an anti-air like in Plus R. Maybe it's a good thing Strive is less expressive. I'm making a bad joke, but it really is true for many players. It's the point I made earlier. Some people simply just prefer these games where there's a fundamental core behind how to win, and so there isn't too many obscure things to worry about. Whereas I and many others prefer games that let me cycle through dozens of different intricately choreographed setups the moment I knock my opponent down. Expression is not the only appealing thing about fighting games, so I don't think it's justifiable to call Strive bad for that reason alone. Nor do I think that people should dismiss others that find Strive boring for that reason. I will call Strive lame though. That's my opinion. I think I've gotten it across a bunch of times already. See me in Plus R where I can hit you with the jump install faultless defense cancel flashback cancel blue Roman cancel though. Some people hate this, others like it. To each their own. Hi, before I end the video, I just wanted to thank you all for watching, especially if you got this far in the video. I really put a lot of effort into it, and I rewrote the entire script a bunch of times, so I appreciate every single one of you that actually sat and watched this. I also want to thank everyone that subscribed to me over the past few months. It just made my day a bit better when I would see a notification and it'd be like, oh, you got a new sub, so thank you for that. I'll be going into my final year of university soon, like really soon, so I just really wanted this video out before then. My life is about to be a whole lot busier, but I'll be trying to make content for the channel whenever I can. Anyways, I really truly appreciate you all, and thank you again. Goodbye for now.